Listening, learning, producing. Our limbs respond to signals from the brain, right? It's your mind that tells your limbs what to do. So essentially, the goal should be to master musical ideas with your mind, not just with your limbs, not with stick-ins. And that's what I was doing in the past. I'm David, and this is the Drum Corner, and today I want to talk about ear training for drummers and why I think it's so important. I want to show you how I went from being musically stagnant to becoming a lot more free on the drums. Something like this. I'm able to hear, do, think, and see musical ideas in my head and on the kit without ever having to need a PDF or another YouTube chops breakdown video. And I did this with 3 simple steps: listening to a lot of material, learning about rhythms, and then producing them on the kit. So here's the premise. Let's face it, we keep hearing that
music is a language, right?
Music is a language.
Music is a language. But do we really approach learning music, and in our case drumming, by mimicking how languages are naturally acquired? Well, a few years ago I was struggling with my drumming, and even though I was practicing and gigging a lot, I wasn't really satisfied with my playing. I couldn't seem to figure out how to play the language I was hearing from my peers and from my drumming heroes, right? So I thought that all I needed to do to solve this was to upgrade my technique, or maybe memorize some more rudiments, or practice longer and harder, enough so muscle memory could just magically kick in, because that's what everybody was saying, right? The truest judge of knowing if a process is working is to look at the results. And it was clear that my results weren't good, so my process wasn't working. Then I had a huge breakthrough when I remembered what I actually should be doing was to mimic the process that got me fluent at my first language, English. In fact, I also remember that's how I acquired the language of music in the first place when I was exposed to it as a child. So I started treating drumming as a language, and I developed my ear by learning to think in sound, and I'll explain that. My results came really quick with a lot less effort, and so all I had to do was to keep following the steps to duplicate the results. So step 1 was listening to feed the brain. I focused on recognizing and familiarizing myself with patterns that I was exposing myself to.
When you're first starting out, listening, right? You got to listen and listen, just absorb as much music as you possibly can. That's my advice anyway.
So let me explain. So sound comes first. If you want to mimic the process that got you fluent at your first language, then first you have to treat it as sound. You have to learn to think in sound. For instance, when a baby is born, there's a period of time where they can't speak at all, right? All that's happening at first is that they're learning to hear what the language sounds like by being exposed to massive input from several sources, like people speaking or TV or music, hashtag Sesame Street. Everything starts off as noise, and it's usually not immediately obvious how the words are pronounced. In fact, they can't hear where one word ends and the other begins. Eventually, through a lot of repetition, they make associations between words and sounds, and that's how we initially learn meanings and context. Develop pronunciation, recognize, categorize words that most commonly appear in that language, and doing this without worrying about grammar and rules. That's important, and that's exactly how we acquire our native language, through listening to material that we understand. Now that's super important, because acquiring is not the same as learning. Acquiring is a natural process, as opposed to learning, which has more to do with actively trying to understand and memorize the rules of a language, like grammar and speech. And in our case as drummers, rules about rhythms and grooves and stick-ins and technique and coordination, etc., which we'll eventually get to. That's important. But sound first, rules second. Your brain is a pattern recognizing machine if you feed it with enough input. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not saying don't ever practice stick-ins and technique and other stuff like that, right? But we could easily fall into the mode of trying to learn music kind of backwards, like trying to learn by memorizing one YouTube lick breakdown chop, at a time. And I was definitely guilty of doing that. Of course, theory and techniques and all that stuff need to be developed. And of course, you need to use drills and exercises and all that stuff. But as master musician Victor Wooten said,
A child speaks a language for years before they even learn the alphabet. Too many rules at the onset will actually slow them down. In my eyes, the approach to music should be the same. After all, music is a language too.
So remember, sound first, rules second. So here's a practical example. Think of the first time you heard of an interesting word. Let's say it's camera. You heard the sound of the word, and then you were able to get the meaning, the pronunciation, the context by hearing the word over and over and over. And then eventually you connected that sound to other sounds or words and their meanings, right? Words like picture, photography, exposure, film, and then eventually you could say this.
Mommy, can I take the picture with the camera?
And maybe even do this. And then eventually this might happen. So if you wanted to use musical terms, we could call this entire process ear training, because that's what it is. And ear training is basically the skill of recognizing patterns, which means developing the ability to hear, to think it, to see it, and then eventually physically express it on our instrument, just like we do in our native language. And that's how it started for me. What I did is I compiled a list of the drumming language that I wanted to produce. And then I spent a lot of time focused on repetitive listening to the same material over and over and over to get the sound of the pattern in my ears and my head first, to the point where I was just hearing them as melodies. So I moved away from simply trying to memorize stick-ins and moved towards the ability to think in sound without even trying to. You see, all limbs respond to signals from our brain, right? Your mind tells your limbs what to do. So essentially the goal is to master musical ideas with your mind, not just with your limbs, not just with stick-ins. And that's what I was trying to do in the past. We want to think mind over muscles. It's like that time I learned my first triplet word, just like the baby on the camera. I didn't know what triplets were. All I knew was the sound, and I just tried to mimic it. Badu, ba dee dee dum, badu, ba dee dee dum. And so because I could already hear and recognize these sounds as melodies, my next step was to spend time learning all I could about them by understanding how to first count them and then how to organize them. And then finally, I created drills and exercises for myself to be able to practice repetition, flow, and musical context. Now notice I didn't start by memorizing stick-ins or rudiments, because sound first, rules second. And that right there started with listening, then I learned how it worked, and then I learned how to produce it, which led to fluency. There's this quote I heard that really resonates with me. It says, listening skills are often underrated. They're a bit like the cone on the ice cream. Not really the thing that everyone talks about, but it's essential to holding everything together. So in my opinion, I don't think you should be the, so where's the stick-in or where's the PDF type of drummer. You see, you ever heard a baby ask for a PDF or a dictionary or thesaurus in order to speak? It's a crazy thought, right? So if you find yourself constantly asking for or needing a PDF for that groove or that fill, then that's a possible indication that you probably haven't developed your ear well enough. So the truest judge to know if a process is working is to look at the results. What have your results been like? Let me know in the comments. Music is sound, and you need to know the sound very well to be a musician, in my opinion. And so if this video resonates with you, then head on over to the next video in this series where we will look into the practical details of the next step of learning music as a language, rhythmic awareness. See you next time in the Drum Corner.